continue to introduce yourselves in the chat, your name, organization, and where you're joining in from today. If you have questions throughout today's event, please use the Q&A function, which is generally located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And when you are asking questions, if you happen to ask any, please do make sure any that you use in the chat, you're addressing them to everyone and not just only panelists. And there will be some polls today, and we do want you to engage and ask questions and interact with them. So as you see polls, do respond to those. And this event is being recorded, and this event will be made available sometime after. And then this event is eligible for an HPAS badge. So if you do earn a badge, you will receive an email with some information about that from GISF Info. Our colleague Megan will get you more information about that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's host, who we're excited to have join us, Larissa Fast. Larissa Fast is a professor of humanitarian and conflict studies and the executive director of the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. So thank you very much, Larissa, for joining us today and for leading us in today's webinar.
Thanks, Tara, for that welcome, and also to GISF for organizing this panel on acceptance, the purpose of which today is to highlight the December 2021 GISF acceptance publication, which I co-edited with Leah Moutard and also with support from Kiara Yankee. So we're going to take the opportunity today to highlight some of the findings from various articles, and we're featuring several of the authors, Pascal Dodin and Rob Grace. And we're going to hopefully further the conversation about acceptance in the context of security risk management. So a couple of things about the paper, if you haven't had the opportunity to read it yet. GISF decided, I guess, about this time last year, maybe a bit earlier, that it was time to update the first major research on acceptance as a security risk management approach, which was published over 10 years ago. And I was one of the lead researchers on that project. I was privileged to work with a variety of organizations and individuals to produce that work, which was supported by then EISF, now GISF, and also now to participate in this new publication that better reflects the current state of play about acceptance. So in the publication, there are 10 articles from a variety of authors and organizations. And in it, they discuss current challenges related to the changing landscape of attacks, to digital risk, counterterrorism, and private security contracting, and share insights from a variety of complementary frameworks, from humanitarian negotiations to choice architecture and intercultural communication. There's also perspectives from a series of organizations about how they actually apply acceptance as part of their security risk management. So each article is available as an individual download, or you can get the entire publication. So today, in our webinar, we have 4 speakers, but first, I guess, a poll to see how you have engaged with the acceptance paper. So if you want to just go ahead and do the poll. And we should be able to, I think everyone can see, we have a couple people participating about if you've had a chance to read it. It looks like a bunch of people have, which is great, and also found it really helpful. So we'll just leave that open, I think, for another few minutes or a few moments maybe. So I think what I'll do, we're going to go in order. We have Pascal Dodin, who has years of experience as a security risk management as a security risk management director and as a policy advisor for the ICRC, but as well CARE and others. We also then will follow with Aradia Mehta, who is the country director for ActionAid in Myanmar. Then we'll hear from Rob Grace, who's an affiliated fellow and researcher at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies at Brown University. And then last, we will hear from Pegah Rajabi, who is security and crisis management support, or part of the security and crisis management support unit at the ICRC. In terms of the poll, it looks like we've had a variety of responses. Again, a few people haven't managed to read the paper, so we are posting, there should be a link in the chat so that you can see that and actually read it at some point. Then also, it looks like most people have found the paper, the report interesting, either yes, very much, or yes, although a couple people no, not really. I'll say more about how you can sort of engage with that at the end. And then finally, do you think the paper will help you improve your practices? In general, everyone said yes, very much, or yes. So thanks for responding to that. I think without further ado, then let's move into hearing from our panelists. Let's start with you, Pascal. So your bio should be in the chat. Pascal, I think in terms of your experience, you have decades of experience in insecure environments, both as the security director and now as a co-founder of Anthroposteep Security. You also contributed an article titled Acceptance Under Stress. So maybe to begin, what do you see as the key challenges and issues for acceptance?
Okay, thank you very much, Larissa, and thank you and the GISF team for convening this meeting.
Pascal, sorry, it's hard to hear you.
Okay.
That's better. That's better.
It's better? Okay.
Yep.
So I'm conscious I'll say the bad guy today, but a couple of years ago with my partner Martin Merkelbach, we were a bit increasingly uncomfortable with this overall I would say acceptance model. We thought that it was maybe a bit too general, and the model does not mean everything becomes dangerous. That was the idea, because we could witness very severe incidents. It could not be attributed to or error of judgment or major negligence.
Pascal?
Yes?
Sorry, can you, if you speak directly in with your head straight on, I think it's easier to hear you.
Okay.
About
that. Yeah, so you're right on my lip. Okay, great. We didn't understand some incidents in terms of attribution of authors or explanation about the purpose, the motives, etc., etc. And we thought also that there was a confusion between acceptance as I would say, philosophical principle, to interact with people you're bringing relief or aid, and acceptance as a tool for getting access to people, which is a bit different, So we thought there was some confusion regarding the term, and so we thought that there was something maybe missing in this acceptance debate. And when you see the latest statistics, I didn't I took from the humanitarian outcome. You say that, in 2020 you had almost 120 people killed, from which is I would say a high number. Okay, you can dispute the statistics and compare with the number of people on the ground, but still it's very serious. Human space is shrinking despite the affirmations from organizations. When you go to Afghanistan, for example, people are bunkerized, even MSF and SRC. They have a lot of difficulties to admit it, but that's the reality. To be a soft target is not necessarily a guarantee of security, and you see that our security guarantees are not perfect, and which lead organizations to withdraw from difficult region. MSF recently from DRC, they have abandoned a couple of projects in the field. So yeah, and we thought that maybe one of the problems till now was what I would call the inward-looking explanation that security incidents are self-generated. When there is a security incident, is the responsibility of the organizations. Misunderstanding, bad programming, disrespect for local customs, co-optation by political parties, or instrumentalization by other actors. There was always this idea that when you are attacked, you have made mistakes. You are the author of a misjudgment, of something you missed in the process of operation, enterprise. And we thought that was a bit, to explain all the incidents we could witness. And we had the impression that you may attack not for what you are. You are attacked because you are a true humanitarian organization, not because you derived from your principles. So you may have actors who have a rejection of humanitarian ethos because it's a stumbling block for their own activities or projects. In some cases, political objectives supersede any form of enterprise. You have movements which are messianic, justify extreme violence as a means of communication. You have also a lot of criminal problem. Criminality plays a role, and you cannot establish real convergence of interests with organizations or with states. So when you are in this situation, I think the risks are very high. Acceptance could be some sort of a trap. But that was one of the conclusions we reached. So you may have to, question the notion of extended dialogue, understanding and value system, strategy, smart programming. Does it work anymore in many situations? I'm not saying that acceptance should be abandoned because I'm not coming from that school, but when these tools or these strategies don't work anymore, are you still accepted or even tolerated? That's the conclusion we reached. And so you have some limits. For example, the fragmentation of proliferation of actors and places where no actor can control really the situation. So you have a great uncertainty while trying to operate in some context. Communities are not able to protect you anymore. They are scared as everybody. You have radicalization of thinking. Everybody is thinking about Islamist movements, but not only. And is inclusion of humanitarian action in political strategies, is also an issue. So yeah. so we were thinking, what do we do if alternance doesn't work anymore? In some circumstances, in some you know, phases of your action, what would you do? And we thought about, you know, would say last resort strategies. I would say in operating in you know, in modes which are not ideal, which you know, are not perfect, but would save a little bit of labor, the remote control, categorization of aid, for example, which always is all this diplomacy, which could be reverse access, meaning that you know, you bring the people to your base instead of going to their places of fighting impunity, you know, following attacks on humanitarian. I know that this is a bit controversial, but I think we are too prone to accept that we are targets. And maybe working with proxies, which also leads to questions regarding standards. You know, transferring risk to people is not exactly. That's probably one of the possible solutions, which are not ideal, as I said, but which could be prevent severe security incidents. So to conclude, I would say that not all security incidents can be avoided by including social issues. You know, that's important. Maybe you are, as I said, you are attacked because what you are. Even if you are perfect operator, respecting principles, being inclusive, can be attacked. Not all security are set. Recognize when it's my mantra, not an efficient strategy. Because sometimes, you know, when I read papers, even acceptance becomes kind of mantra, an advertisement. But does it really exist on the ground? Maybe
Pascal.
You know, yes. You may also, you know, understand why security guarantees are not real, you know, I regret sometimes that the acceptance debate is a bit sometimes biased by the humanitarian imperative. I'm not sure you are totally objective when you know, you have vested interest, even, you know, virtuous interest, and you don't recognize that your position is extremely precarious. Yeah. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Pascal. And for those who had some trouble hearing Pascal, he talked a lot about what was in his article, including sort of ways forward around reverse access and handing over to other authors, digital proximity, you know, a focus on sponsors and mentors. So a plug for his paper if you couldn't hear him very well there. So I'd like to turn now to Aradia Mehta, who is country director for Action Aid in Myanmar. So Aradia, you work in women's rights programs in Myanmar. So from your vantage point, what does acceptance mean, and what are some of the key challenges for implementing an acceptance approach in your work? And your bio should be in the chat. Sorry, thanks, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Larissa. So I think, so firstly, I'd like to say that, you know, at a very given level, acceptance implies that there is a degree of trust and support by the key stakeholders, which we seek to work with or provide relief to or to support in some form or the other. And it takes time to be accepted. I think, it requires building relations with the community, establishing trust, and having a joint commitment towards whatever goal that is being sort of achieved. But going a step further, it's also really important to recognize that, what are we referring to? Acceptance by who? We live in incredibly polarized societies and very, very polarized contexts where acceptance by one community could imply the rejection by another. And I think, these are not sort of concepts which refer to monolithic bodies. And, there's a lot of change, a lot of different actors, different vested interests. And I think, it is important to recognize that acceptance is not apolitical. It's not a neutral concept. And so, for example, we work on gender-based violence, a lot around women's rights. And, whilst we do that, on the one hand, we've got our key stakeholders, many of which are women, have accepted some of the work that we're doing, whereas a lot of the male counterparts very often haven't. But even going beyond that, I think, in this current context where we're seeing a growing rise of authoritarianism, many countries have sort of leadership at the helm which don't respect basic democratic norms. Acceptance of civil society, NGOs, is definitely a shrinking space. And the question is that, who is it that we're trying to be accepted by? And I one of the points that I'd like to mention is that I think, very often the use of the humanitarian imperative and, all of that is couched in very neutral terms. But I think the reality of this is that this is highly contested. It's also very dynamic. It evolves, it changes, and that, we need to navigate this very carefully. How do we actually do this? And a large part of, when you link this with safety and security, for example, a lot of this is about sharing information. And where does one get information? I mean, now there are some brilliant firms that are doing risk analysis, that are doing safety and security analysis, providing information on a very ongoing sort of basis. But this comes from having a very nuanced understanding of the context within which one is operating. It implies having strong relations on the ground that through which this information is fed and is shared. And that is also to do with how securely this information is being shared and to whom is it being shared. So I think, a lot of this is built on being able to communicate, setting up processes, systems that allow for that, but constantly also, acknowledging just how contested, the notion of acceptance is. And whose acceptance are we sort of vying for? Whose acceptance are we looking for? And I think, I believe this is also a matter of degree. So not only it is about the who, so which actors, but it's very much also about the degree to which we want to be accepted, right? So there's a very basic core minimum where if I'm operating in a very complicated, complex situation, much like Myanmar, which, is currently under the junta, safety, security for my team, for the partners is a huge concern. But at the same time, I do know that in order for me to operate, I need to navigate, the military architecture so that I have access to certain places so that we're able to provide humanitarian relief and response. However, that does not imply that, the acceptance goes as deep as, working jointly together, because that would undermine, the civil disobedience movement. It would undermine the resistance that we're seeing unfold, which is incredibly powerful. So I think this is where the politics plays into it, I think, at the very, very center and the very heart of, what we talk about acceptance. I think that said, I do think it is absolutely important that, the first point of entry has to be that the communities and the people that we work with, that we serve or that we seek to serve, have, there is a relationship of trust, there is a relationship of acknowledgement of the intervention that will happen, and it has to be done in a fashion which is joint. I mean, there was a time, I think, where humanitarian response was done in a very traditional fashion. We would fly people in and they'd be sort of giving relief. And I think there was very little that was done to build up local capacity or recognize local capacity. So I think that there has been a lot that has happened, that has changed, where, fantastic local civil society organizations are able to, be the frontline responders and are able to sort of navigate the complexities of community acceptance for themselves. And of course, how they do it with various different, government counterparts. I don't think there is one right answer or, that sort of fits all. But I guess the main, points that I would like to stress on is that trust and relationships are absolutely key. The second is that sharing information. I think, linking this to security is about how are we gathering information? Where are we gathering this information from? Do we have these linkages and networks that we can rely on, that are secure, that can pass on information? I think that's absolutely essential. I think being discreet is something that we need to make sure that we're doing. So, we're not flashing the brands while we're going in to do something. And I can, share a bit more around this, but I guess, to say what are the challenges, I think there are many. How do we respond to that? I think, we adapt, we watch, we constantly negotiate, navigate. I don't think we have a blueprint response for, how are we being accepted with the different stakeholders that we work with. But we do also create certain red lines where we say, okay, this level of acceptance is all right because it allows for certain levels of access, but it does not go as far as necessarily working hand in hand with entities that we find unsavory. So I think it really is a balance between the degrees of acceptance that we're looking for, which are of course much higher when we're talking about communities or local civil society. And at the same time, it's also a question about acceptance from who. And I think to remember that this is deeply political, it's not a neutral concept, and it should be considered as that. Thank you.
Thanks. I find that really interesting, the notion that you could have sort of like you aim for higher acceptance from communities and perhaps lesser acceptance from government authorities, sort of the minimum level in order to operate in these highly politicized environments. So interesting that between you and Pascal, we've heard a lot about sort of the highly political and politicized environments within which humanitarian organizations must operate. And so you both have done a great job in highlighting some of these tensions that exist. I think I'm going to turn now to Rob, and just a reminder to people, if you have questions, share them in the Q&A. But we'll sort of shift gears slightly to Rob Grace, who is one of the authors or co-authors of one of the publications in the acceptance report around humanitarian negotiations. So Rob, you come at this topic as a bit of an outsider, if I might use that term, meaning you're an expert in humanitarian negotiation, and your article proposes a series of insights for acceptance that build on your work on humanitarian negotiation and bring that into thinking about acceptance. So tell us, what are some of these lessons that you are bringing?
Sure, happy to be here as an outsider, and I do come into this room with an evangelical agenda that I hope to convert you all to. I hope to persuade you all that there is a great deal of value that we can gain by doing a better job of marrying the field of negotiation scholarship with the field of humanitarian practice. There has been work done on this, especially in the past 10 years. Humanitarian negotiation has become a big field, but there's much more work to be done. So I'll lay out 4 dilemmas of acceptance that we can think about in terms of ideas that come from negotiation scholarship. Here's the first one. First one is a dilemma of what is going to be the major orientation of your behavioral approach in a negotiation and when you're considering security risk management and access. So I'll lay out this dilemma that comes from negotiation scholarship. It's called the negotiator's dilemma. The logic of it is that a negotiator has 2 broad choices that they can choose from when they're thinking about how they want to negotiate. First is the integrative approach. And this is an approach that sort of maps onto acceptance. It's an approach where you want to engage with your counterpart in an open exchange about what your interests are. You want to be transparent about what you're doing and why. And it's more a process of creative brainstorming to try to reach an agreement that is mutually beneficial to both of you. The idea being that if you can do that, you can find some agreements between you that you wouldn't have found if you hadn't engaged in such an open and transparent exchange. The second approach is called distributive negotiation. And this is pressure-based. This is where you go in and maybe you're using deceit, but you're really trying to pressure your counterpart into doing what you want them to do. You could think of this as mapping roughly onto a deterrence approach. For the humanitarian, this could mean using threats of public denunciation, threats of withdrawing or scaling down operations. And it's a question of which approach should you choose. If you go to the integrative route, you do get those benefits that can come from 2 partners engaging in a transparent and collaborative exchange. But the logic of the dilemma is that your best approach depends on the approach that the counterpart takes. So if you take an integrative approach and your counterpart takes a distributive approach, you wound up getting taken advantage of because you're there trying to negotiate in earnest. Your partner is trying to look for ways that they can pressure you and use the information that you're giving them to their advantage. So you might think, oh, okay, maybe I should do the distributive route, but then you have the potential of missing out on the gains that you could get if you chose an integrative approach. So that's the dilemma, that you're choosing between 2 risky options. One, the integrative approach has the promise of cooperation and gains, but the risk of being taken advantage of. The distributive approach for you has the possible benefit of great gains if you can pressure your counterpart into doing what you want them to do, but then you might miss out on the fruits of cooperation that you would get. So it's a way to frame a dilemma and thinking about when an acceptance approach might be beneficial to adopt, or when one might want to downplay an acceptance approach and perhaps use other security risk management tools at one's disposal. But the basic logic is go into an acceptance approach being mindful of what the risks are. The second dilemma is also in that same vein. We call it the right distance relationship dilemma. The logic of this, it comes from, again, from scholarship on negotiation, is the relationship between these 2 things. One is the relationship between the counterparts, and 2 is this actual substance at hand. The logic of acceptance is that the 2 are related. You're cultivating a relationship with people in the local environment, and you're doing that in order to mitigate your own security risks, in order to facilitate humanitarian access. That's the logic of it. The other risk that comes from negotiation scholarship is that when negotiators try to do that, what can happen is that the relationship actually becomes not the means to the end, but actually sort of becomes the end. And you wind up compromising on the actual substance of what you're discussing in order to prioritize preserving and maintaining and actually nourishing that relationship. So it kind of turns acceptance on its head, and it illustrates the risk that when pursuing acceptance, you do not want to make sure, you do not want to make the relationship the actual end. You want to be mindful of that being a means to an end. The third dilemma I want to highlight, this has already been discussed by Aradia and Pascal, but I think it's worth framing in negotiation terms, is a multi-level game dilemma. And it comes from logic of international negotiations when governmental leaders are negotiating with other foreign leaders. So they have a win set that comes from those negotiations, but they also have to sell the agreement to a domestic audience. So they also have a domestic win set. And the question is, what is the overlap between those two win sets? It's just a way of looking at a negotiation where you have multiple audiences. And in acceptance and humanitarian negotiation, you have many different audiences. You have the local population, you have the government, you have potentially non-state armed group, you have your donors, you have the other leaders in the local environment. And the question is there an overlapping win set between all of those audiences? And if not, how are you going to navigate between that lack of overlap? Where are you going to compromise, and which audience are you going to prioritize when adopting this approach? And the fourth and final dilemma that I'll highlight, call it the no deal dilemma, which is basically that it's hard for humanitarians to walk away from a negotiation. And a lot of negotiation thinking and scholarship is based on the idea that you want to analyze your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, that is the key. You want to identify that, and then you can determine what you're actually negotiating about and what is the bottom line that you will establish for yourself. For humanitarians, those are very highly charged questions, and it can be hard to walk away because it basically means potentially not fulfilling your organizational mandate, walking away from people that you would be helping if you were to stay and try to negotiate. So there's a dilemma there in trying to really articulate in a real way your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, the BOTNA in the humanitarian negotiation. So those are four issues that my co-author Alain Lampour and I lay out in the paper. They're not revolutionary ideas, I would say as well. It's more a matter of giving vocabulary to a lot of ideas that are already in humanitarians' minds and structuring thinking around them. But there's much more that can be done, and much more that can be drawn from negotiation scholarship that I think can further inform how acceptance strategies can and should be approached. Over to you, Larissa.
Yeah, thanks. That's again a very it strikes me too. In hearing you speak, I'm sort of reminded by the fact that in many cases the individuals that humanitarians are negotiating with are not the people. They're the gatekeepers, right? They're not the individuals who suffer if humanitarians walk away from the negotiation. In some cases they might be, but yeah, just a useful sort of reminder that negotiation theory does have a lot to offer, and also sort of a difference, a way that sort of the negotiating of access can also bring insights back to humanitarian negotiations. So thanks for that. Okay, I think let's go to Pega, who has worked with a variety of different organizations on intersectionality and staff diversity. So I'd like to ask, from your perspective, what are some of the contributions and challenges of staff diversity for acceptance?
Great, thank you, Larissa. So maybe I'll just start by saying I'm going to use the term personal profiles when I talk about diversity, and that just refers to an intersection of a very wide array of factors, things like age, gender, nationality, marital status, physical ability, disability, sexual orientation. All of these things make up a personal profile. I think when we talk about acceptance and when we talk about diversity within the sector, it's really not a box ticking exercise, but it has very real consequences for our operations and what we do on the ground. Of course, it's important, but it's also it also helps to look at it in terms of how it can have an impact. So in terms of how it can contribute to acceptance, You know, we work with very diverse populations, and in order to be able to address their needs and have solutions that can actually be effective, we need to also have a diverse group of staff that can interact and understand what those issues are, understand the context, and connect with the populations that we're engaging with. Another thing is access. You know, different diversity allows us to access different groups of people. Rob was just mentioning the various stakeholders that we might interact with, and all of those may require different people who could push or negotiate or really have that acceptance. So I'll give you an example. When we look at diversity in terms of locally, nationally, or internationally recruited staff, we really need this diversity. We need to all work together because every profile has a different thing to offer. When we are doing recruitment, it can often be helpful to have an internationally recruited staff who can be a bit more of a neutral, unbiased person, as opposed to having somebody who might be from that community or might be a national of that country, and might unfairly so, but they might be accused of bias in recruitment, and that can have all sorts of issues for the organization's acceptance. On the other hand, there are situations where we really need to have locally or nationally recruited staff who understand the context and have their own networks and understand the nuances in a discussion or negotiation. So having a combination of these diverse profiles can really contribute to our acceptance. And the last thing I want to talk about is neutrality. By having a diverse group of people in an organization, it kind of dilutes having a specific profile of what a person that works for that organization might look like, whether it's religion or nationality or ethnicity or race, whatever it may be. By having these different profiles around the table, then that can help really have an identity of the organization and not be attached to a specific person or what a specific person may look like. On the other hand, there are also many challenges when we talk about diversity within the humanitarian sector and how that impacts acceptance. And Aradia was saying, you know, you might have acceptance with one community, but it doesn't mean you're going to have it with others, or it might actually hurt your acceptance with another community. And this also applies when we talk about diversity. One specific profile may very much contribute to acceptance within certain communities, but may not with others. And this is something, you know, there's the great GISF triple Venn diagram of how risk is the intersection between context, the organization and role, and the personal profile of the person. So really diverse, when we talk about diversity, it changes from context to context. And we can't always have just any group of people working in any context, because it can have real security consequences. You know, at the far extreme, it can have security consequences, but at the other extreme, it can have an impact on our acceptance. So yeah, I mean, this can often mean taking into consideration what a certain profile may have, what impact a certain profile may have on acceptance or on security. We often put restrictions in place. We might say a certain nationality cannot work in this country. Someone of a particular ethnicity or race cannot work in this region because of a perception issue or because of past security incidences. And this is very tricky to manage as an organization, because we need to be careful. We need to really balance our duty of care with not being biased and discriminatory. So how we go about this is really important, and it's something that we're really developing more at the ICRC and also in other organizations around the sector. And I just want to say discrimination can be justified. It's when discrimination is arbitrary, that's when we have problems. So if we are putting in restrictions in place for particular deployments or certain areas, we need to make sure that they are done transparently, systematically, and to really be based on a risk assessment and not just not up to one person's discretion. So those are some of the challenges that we face. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I was actually just going to ask about that in terms of sort of what suggestions do you have for people trying to implement that sort of approach to personal profiles? How can, like, you've mentioned some of the pitfalls that arise, but what about trying to address those? And you just sort of talked about one, you know, creating those risk assessments that can justify that positive discrimination, even though recognizing that that can be hugely problematic. So again, just a reminder to everyone to use the Q&A if you have questions for the panelists. But I think I'm going to ask a general question of all panelists about sort of, you've all shared a series of lessons or insights based on your own experience. So what advice, what suggestions do you have about how organizations can begin to integrate these into their own approaches to acceptance and security risk management? Anyone want to go first on that? Perhaps about sort of dealing with those political tensions, sort of working with different populations. You know, how do you bring to bear those negotiation frameworks, or how do you you know, bring in staff diversity? How do you hold in tension those that need to have different degrees of acceptance with different organizations?
I'm happy to jump in.
Go for it. Yeah.
From the standpoint of negotiation capacity building, if we do accept that it is important for humanitarians to understand their role as negotiators, and we are accepting that it is important to cultivate negotiation capital, whether it's for pursuing an acceptance strategy or other dimensions of security risk management, or other dimensions of access, or even other dimensions of humanitarian work, we need to take negotiation capacity building very seriously. And what that requires is a very sustained effort, and even a transformation of organizational culture, potentially. You do not go to a humanitarian negotiation workshop and then afterwards think, cool, I know how to negotiate, excellent. It needs to be a long-term process of placing thinking and strategizing around negotiation in conversation with what your practices are in your professional life. So what is required, and again, these are sort of ideas and vocabulary that comes from the world of negotiation scholarship, is creating a negotiation ecosystem within organizations and across organizations across the humanitarian sector. So it takes an individual commitment of individual humanitarians to take themselves seriously as negotiators and cultivate their own negotiation capacity. It takes an organizational commitment to facilitate those efforts through workshops, peer-to-peer exchanges, for discussions after negotiations, to talk about how, you know, what went right, what went wrong. And it also takes a systemic effort as well across organizations to create a community of negotiators that can share experiences with one another and have forums available to them that they can share reflections on their practice of negotiations. So just wanted to sort of flag that for sort of painting out a vision of what must be done if we do want to push forward this notion of the importance of humanitarian negotiation to acceptance and to humanitarian work more broadly.
Yeah, so in other words, thinking about it as a professional development opportunity and encouraging those conversations could be one approach to that. Any of the other panelists, anything else you wanted to add there? Yep. Go ahead, Pascal.
Yeah, well, maybe a few words about diversity, because it's a major subject. But I think some organizations take it as a dogma, and use cliche to justify diversity. I think we all agree that people are more welcome, more legitimate than others, but it depends on the context, and it's what's Pega said. Should not say that people with dark complexion will be more accepted in Africa. This is a cliche. This is a terrible cliche. Or women should not work in Afghanistan. It's also a terrible cliche. It depends on the situation. It depends on the people, the personalities, experience, etc. We should not speak in terms of gender, races, ethnic background. It doesn't help at all. It depends on the context, depends on the task, and also, and when I'm saying about task, it's difficult. It's totally different to talk about explaining the situation to somebody else than to decide. Decide is a risk, especially when you say no to people. And if you're a local person, maybe you're more, threatened than somebody who is coming from outside, who has no link with the specific communities, etc., etc. So I think it's a very, I would say, it's a tailor-made enterprise to use diversity. You have to really know the context and then put people where they can be best employed. I had a colleague was Swiss from Nigerian background, and we were in Chechnya together, and I asked him, do you feel comfortable? Because Russia is not exactly welcoming, very welcoming environment for people with dark complexion. And he said, I'm swimming in racism since I was born. I was subject to racism in Switzerland. So I'm used to it. I can handle it. I can manage it. No worries. So it's beyond the cliche. You have to know the people, how they can handle a situation, and then put them in charge of something precise before saying that we should have women there because people from some specific ethnic background because it's going to help the negotiation. It's not that unfortunately that simple. Another thing about acceptance is the duty of care, because now we are working with the RCRC about the duty of care policy. And we are, struggling with the fact that with the problem with people with specific vulnerabilities, like homosexual in Saudi Arabia. What's the responsibility of an organization to send or not send people with that sexual orientations to Saudi Arabia, where they could be submitted to death penalty. This is a huge responsibility, and at the same time, you need to protect the private sphere of people. How do you do that? How do you integrate that in the institutional policy? And that's in terms of acceptance. That's also a question. It's a difficult question. It's a very tricky question, but it needs to be put on the table if you want to be honest with the people you employ. And if you want to protect them against hostile action, legal action as well. What do you do if one of your colleagues is detained by a certain country for its sexual orientation? Do you feel responsible or not? Is it something totally private? Should you inform the person beforehand, etc., etc.? I think in terms of acceptance, the assessment of I would say specific vulnerabilities should be also put into the global equation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pascal. I noticed we have a couple questions coming into the Q&A. That's great. Please keep posting them, and I'll turn to them in just a minute. Pega, I don't know if you wanted to respond to any of that, or Radia, if you have any thoughts to add. It strikes me that one of the things that really has advanced from sort of when I first did the research on acceptance to now is this, a growing recognition of the importance of these personal profiles and how they do really create very specific risks unique to individuals rather than sort of groups. And so we have to really consider that in a nuanced way, that I don't know that as a sector we did 10 to 15 years ago. So that I think is a welcome change over the past decade or so. Peggy, I'll highlight you just in case you have anything specific there.
Sure, thanks, Larissa. I completely agree. I mean, I think this conversation has really gained momentum in the past few years, and it's been interesting and also frustrating to watch discussions around diversity in the sector, because I think there's instances where it has been so overused that it has lost its meaning and has not been taken seriously in certain contexts, which is a shame because I think it's actually incredibly important. Just going to back to what Pascal was saying a little bit, I think we do need to be very aware of how we think about diversity and security, and having quotas of we need 50% women on our team is not really enough. Sometimes it can backfire and actually can hurt the objective of having more diversity on the teams. What's really important is having support from from the entire hierarchy, so both at headquarters and at the country levels, having a real commitment to increasing diversity, and that doesn't mean just appointing people so that you can fill your quotas. Of course, those quotas can be helpful in some instances, but we really need to build capacity and allow people to grow within the organization and not set them up for failure. So I think that's something important to think about, and having diversity at all levels of the hierarchy. So people in decision-making positions, people in management, we also need diversity there, and not just in terms of numbers, but also at what level they are. I think, Pascal, your point about our duty of care is a really, really interesting one, and it's not an easy topic to discuss because there's so many nuances, and it really depends so much on the context. But I think one thing that we are trying to do more as part of our duty of care is to share information, to have those conversations about personal profiles and the risks that different people may face in different contexts. So, for example, you were mentioning someone who is same, maybe they may be LGBTQ plus working in Saudi Arabia. That to me doesn't have to be something that restricts them from working there. I think what we must do as an organization is inform them of what the laws are in that country, what the risks they may face are, what the risks are both formally but also informally within society, not just with authorities. So first is having that informed consent of them knowing what they're getting themselves into, and making that information public. So we're not forcing individuals to disclose their sexual orientation, but if someone chooses not to, they can access this information. And I know last year with HMPW, GISF put on their website a page of really great resources of risks related to various personal profiles. So I encourage everyone to have a look at that if you haven't already. So making that information public, internally within the organization, accessible to everyone. But also behavior comes in as well. If you have people need to understand what the risks are and adjust their behavior accordingly, and that is part of our responsibility as staff. We all have responsibility with as how for our own security. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just plug, maybe Megan or someone from GISF can post that link in the chat so people who aren't aware of that can actually get access. Radia, anything to add before I go to the Q&A?
Yeah, thanks, Larissa. I think lots of very interesting points that have come up and been sort of shared about, how do we take this forward? And I think Rob, the point around, negotiations being essential and key, I think I would push that a bit to sort of say, I think we need a dialogue. And I think, negotiations is one entry point that comes in, but it's not always that it, resonates with the cultural context that we're operating in. And I think, this is where it does become slightly complicated and tense, because in order to get, let's say, access, acceptance might be sort of much further down the road, but there are different ways in which that has to be approached based on which country you're in, what the cultural context is, and what is actually appreciated as an entry point to that discussion. We had several negotiations with a village chief in Ghana about doing a project on maternal health. And then it was, we found out there was gin and live chickens and goats is the offering that needed to be made. And I think it was an interesting kind of switch in the way in which, a lot of the team also interacted with how to sort of go about, engaging in this conversation of acceptance in a very sort of culturally specific context that one is operating in. But then I think some of the other points around, what are the key takeaways? I think a lot of it is about how we go about it. So for example, in Myanmar, this is incredibly fraught. I think everybody is very interested in securing access to certain areas because humanitarian assistance is desperately needed. We're talking about 14.4 million that are in need of dire humanitarian assistance. And very often the questions are, do we work collectively as civil society and NGOs, or do we sort of leverage the differences, based on slightly different mandates and where we work and approach it, with different entry points. And I think, on some matters, we're very unified and we're a collective, and on other matters, we're not. So I think, again, it goes back to seeing what the situation is. I think it's incredibly important. I think, Rob, the point around expanding the skill set. So I think, when we recruit people that are part of the humanitarian response, I think, it's very much looking at how are they able to provide, good quality response in a timely fashion. And I think negotiation, arbitration, mediation are not skills that we often look out for. I think that definitely needs to change. So I think we need to integrate this much more centrally to the way in which, we hire teams that focus on humanitarian relief and response in light of sort of acceptance. I think two very key takeaways for us has been, deeper focus on localization of aid. I think we're not talking about that enough. I think, the politics of aid and who is providing it, how is it being provided? I think, Pegah, you've sort of touched upon it through the diversity lens, but I think this is more about how do we empower local communities to be the responders, to be empowered, to sort of set the tone and determine, the ways in which response will happen that suits, the context that we're operating in, and also kind of allow for more national grassroots civil society spaces to take that leadership. I think humanitarian response has been very heavily dominated by international actors, and I think there needs to be a greater focus. I mean, it's happening, but I think there is more that needs to be done in that space. And finally, the point around, I think the response has to be very adaptive. It has to be responsive. We need to analyze the way in which we respond. Is it, are we adhering to the do no harm principles? Are we actually looking at a response that is conflict sensitive? What are the ways in which our intervention impacts and affects different stakeholders across the board? And I think, this is something that definitely needs much more attention. And I think, again, in the context of Myanmar, the moment there is a humanitarian response that's planned, I think there's a lot more thought that's put into not just what is the response that will be, whether it's water, shelter, food, etc., but how is it impacting everybody that is sort of linked to the response directly, indirectly, and what are the do no harm principles in light of this particular response. So yes, I guess that's the basic sort of takeaways that I feel that from the experience of Myanmar that could potentially be helpful in some of the other contexts. Thanks, Larissa.
Thanks, Radia. I think what I'll do is actually take our Q&A from in reverse order, at least the first three that we've gotten, in part because what you were just saying is sort of a nice segue into the last question around acceptance and localization, which is something we definitely recognized was not it was something we wanted to feature in the publication, but we weren't able to do that. So that is definitely something, if this is a passion of yours, to consider submitting a proposal to GISF to actually write something on this. But in any case, the question is acceptance and localization, are they two self-canceling notions? And if not, how can organizations nurture a culture of acceptance-based programming when national teams or local partners take the lead in field implementation? How is acceptance understood and practiced by local teams and country teams with little or no international staff? So anyone want to take a crack at that?
Maybe very, very briefly, I think it's a really good question. And I don't think, I think, I'm not sure whether this would serve as an adequate answer, but I believe the way in which, so an organization like ours, for example, there's a lot of work where we've done direct humanitarian response work, but a large part of our work is around supporting local organizations, grassroots organizations, to sort of empower them, to build that capacity for them to be able to respond in certain areas, and doing it in a way that mentors them across different sort of areas, so that sort of capacity is built over time. And I think, it isn't a straightforward sort of process. And for example, one of the most contested issues today in Myanmar has been most of our local civil society organizations have very publicly come out and said that, we are not interested in providing a response in these areas where there is, a dire need, if the organizations we work with agree to register with the current junta, because they see that as legitimizing it. And see that as a direct way in which the bigger political movement, which is the civil disobedience movement, would be undermined. And then, how does one relate that to the international humanitarian law or principles of, neutrality and humanitarian relief? So I think, how does acceptance, how do we negotiate, how do we bring people to come to a common understanding and a common goal when it is so deeply polarized, or political, actually is the right word, is something that I don't think after a year of the coup that we have an answer for. But however, at the same time, I do strongly believe that greater initiatives and efforts need to be put in empowering local groups in order for them to act. I think they need to be recognized much more. I think there is a lot of work that has been done by groups for them to sort of respond in incredible ways, which often goes unrecognized. And I think the politics that come with local and international interventions and organizations is sometimes not given its due space when we talk about localization, acceptance, and how we're sort of working through these concepts on a very real life basis. But I mean, these are just some stray thoughts over here. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Anyone else want to add to that? Go ahead, Pascal.
Yeah. Very, very short comment. I think that there's a potential collision between, I would say, localization and impartiality. This is one of the main problems we have. Talking about impartiality in Ukraine, for example, you have victims on one side. Working with local people will be extremely difficult, for example, in the Russian-controlled territories with, the bad victims, the ones who are not recognized as victims. So working with local organizations or local people, etc., it's extremely important to decentralize the decisions, to not to impose, I would say, a dominant model. But at the same time, you can expect people from the place to be totally impartial, to accept, to cross the line and to have their so-called enemies. So it's one of the issue, and so impartiality is the for me, the main problematic principle to apply in the field. To say that all victims are equal, that we will examine the needs, we will not discriminate anybody, blah blah blah. Yes, right. But you work with human beings, with opinions, with feelings, with people who have suffered. So have to, localization is a very nice concept, but to apply, in a polarized environment is a bit more tricky than people think. It's not just to say that we will empower people on the ground and everything will be okay. Yes, but people on the ground have also, a level of hate, a level of opinions against people, etc., etc. So I think, yeah, localization is probably one way to follow, but should not be the ultimate response in conflict situation. I'm talking about conflicts. I'm not talking about developments, situation where this issue do not exist. So I think yes, potential collision between localization and impartiality, and of course linked to acceptance issue.
Right, but not necessarily a conflict between localization and acceptance per se. Yeah. Rob or Pega, any thoughts on this that you want to offer? And it's okay if not, yeah. Okay, so then let's turn to the question around from Peter Scott Bowden. There's a growing awareness that negotiation capacity building is needed. However, there's still a huge gap, as Rob stated, to get organizations to prioritize it. Do the panelists see the need to tackle or enhance humanitarian negotiation, enhance agency humanitarian negotiations? So I guess it looks like the nuance I'm trying to tackle here is the difference between building capability of an individual to negotiate and an agency negotiation. So if I can reframe that slightly, I think you're talking about the different levels of negotiation. Building capacity or capability of an individual to negotiation or to negotiate doesn't necessarily translate to a better ability of an agency to negotiate access. So Rob, I think that one's tailor-made for you. Do you want to try and answer that?
Sure. Probably not surprising. I do see the need to tackle enhancing agency humanitarian negotiation. I think before I sort of get into that, I wanted to take a step back and also sort of talk about what we mean when we're talking about negotiation, and especially this sort of question about, are we engaging in negotiation or are we engaging in dialogue, as Aradia was pointing to? Because I encounter this a lot as I'm engaging with different humanitarians about how they see negotiation fitting into their work. And I see this tension where, as Peter says in his question, that there's a growing awareness about the importance of negotiation, but at the same time, I do repeatedly encounter practitioners not sensing that negotiation is the right word to describe what they want to do. I think that this sort of the question that this brings to me is sort of what is aroused in one's mind when one thinks of negotiation. And if the word negotiation evokes like, hey, let's cut a deal, then I agree that is not what I want to promote and what we should be promoting in the humanitarian sector. But if the word negotiation arouses a broader view of how one can think about their engagements in their work in a more structured and strategic manner, and evokes the possibility of bringing in some frameworks of thinking from negotiation analysis, then that I think is very much a positive and something that I do think should be promoted. But really the integrative approach to negotiation really is a dialogue approach to negotiation. It really is a discussion and about building trust and building a relationship and building a collaborative type of interpersonal interaction with your counterpart. But to get to Peter's question, yes, I absolutely agree. It evokes in me a framework that is in an HD handbook HD Center handbook on humanitarian negotiation that was published in the mid-2000s. It still has a lot of insights that I still find to be very valuable. It just discusses negotiations that happen on different levels, the high level, strategic level, where you have heads of agencies, sometimes negotiating with heads of state, the operational mid-tier negotiations where you're negotiating with the line ministries, and the ground level frontline negotiations where you're negotiating through checkpoints. They all can be very much interrelated, and I very much agree that capacitating individual negotiators is an important, necessary but insufficient step to tackle the problem of access and acceptance that it is something that requires a strategic approach that spans all of those levels. So couldn't agree more on that. Back to you, Larissa.
Yeah, so just in thinking about sort of, in some ways, to use your analogy, the sort of approach to negotiation as a way of engaging in dialogue, building trust, all of those sorts of characteristics that are important for acceptance could be part of the sort of agency level thinking around negotiation. And to do that, you also need individuals who are very capable negotiators in that sort of frontline way, or even mid-level way. Yeah. So last question that we have, and if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to post them into the chat, but is there a formula, this comes from Clayton Amwanga, is there a formula that can be used to ascertain or quantify a level of acceptance like we do when analyzing risk? Pascal, I see you smiling, smirking, so maybe I'll pass that one to you and then see if anyone else wants to add.
Yes, the answer is very short. It's no. No, I'm a firm adversary of bingo game, and scale and cards, etc. And it's it would be a waste of time to design a formula or system which will give you, a percentage. What does it mean if I tell you that you're 65% accepted? What about the rest? It's exactly like the risk management. Would you go or not? And that's the, because it's a yes or no question. It's not to establish that you are 25% and you have augmented your acceptance by 10% last month. I don't think it's a way to proceed. It's just to try to put fake science into something which is more a question of experience and knowledge for me. I'm very radical. Sorry. There's no nuance in my. I'm too old to but I guess that's for me. I'm not convinced by the fact that be the scale or matrix, whatever, to the level.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's I don't know that you can quantify a level of acceptance. I mean, I think in the original research, we took the approach of identifying a continuum from complete acceptance through to rejection, with tolerance perhaps somewhere in the middle. I know that's something that's debated, but I do think that notion of degrees of acceptance, which may differ according to the various populations that you might be trying to engage with, that will differ perhaps according to individual, but certainly according to group and region. that you know, of the individuals that you're interacting with. So I think getting that sort of formula is really tricky and perhaps leads you down a very a dangerous path in the sense of, you know, being too confident of a level of acceptance that may or may not be there. So it's definitely something, as many of you have talked about, it's acceptance is dynamic, it's highly nuanced, it's changing. So I think if there are no other questions, maybe I will just turn it over to each of you. If there's anything else you wanted to add, a sort of summary, something, a takeaway you'd like people to leave with before I have a couple of closing remarks. So anyone want to jump in here?
Yeah. Larissa, just I take a quick couple of points. I think this question that was raised earlier, which was around sort of individual versus collective or organizational negotiation. I think that's a really important point, because a lot of the individual negotiation, whether it's at the highest level or mid or junior level, doesn't translate it into becoming an institutional approach. And I think for it to be an organizational or institutional approach, you know, that requires certain systemic ways in which this is integrated, not just in how we hire people, but also how we, you know, program design, you know, how we allow for these discussions or this dialogue. You know, how do we sort of plan a response that accommodates for negotiations or for having, you know, these incredibly difficult conversations at different levels. So I think there is, you know, I think there is a big distinction, and I think, you know, to have an organizational or institutional approach is very different and distinct from having an individual negotiating sort of approach. And I guess also just sort of speaking about, you know, is there a fixed formula? And I think I wonder whether this is also some, you know, something to do with having, you know, making a few mistakes, right? And I think, you know, giving a little bit of space to failure to reflect and think about, you know, how certain choices were made that allowed for better acceptance, and what did that really look like? And, you know, look at it in ways in which sort of, which is more intuitive, more reflective. And I think, you know, actually these risk matrices, you know, that give us an indication, I think are often, you know, not as helpful as we'd like them to be. I mean, I think they're very detailed and there's a lot of sort of coding and, you know, different levels, etc. But I'm not sure that it really goes to the heart of it. And I think what makes it slightly complicated for both, actually, for risk and for acceptance, is the fact that these are, you know, changing, they're dynamic, they evolve, and they're not static, you know, in any way. You know, how different authorities react and respond, how access is negotiated, how acceptance is seen at the local level, community level, or higher level. So I think it definitely requires an approach which is a bit more iterative and adaptive, rather than you know, how sort of it has become with a lot of the risk assessments that happen.
Great, thanks, Aradia. Pega, Rob, or Pascal, any closing comments you want to make? Go ahead, Pascal. Yeah.
Thank you, Larissa. Well, in terms of, you know, the negotiation acceptance, I guess we should be very clear that, you know, you don't learn to play tennis by attending webinar on tennis or reading books on tennis. You learn to play tennis by playing tennis with a coach and by losing, you know, and then, you know, progressively you improve your scores. It's the same thing with acceptance or a negotiation. You know, there are things which you would be interesting to read in books or manuals or handbooks, etc., etc. but the mileage and the various contexts you've been will be your certification. I would say, and I'm not sure you should put too much emphasis on courses, certification, training curriculum, etc., etc. At the end of the day, you've learned with people more experienced than you by certain mimetism. You had a boss who was very good and who brought you into meetings, and you just shut your mouth and you observe and you try to imitate, and then you develop your own theories. But I guess that's important. Most important thing for me, it's a practice, and to put practice at the center of this reflection, even if afterwards you develop scientific theories, and concept. That's fine, but you don't negotiate with concept. You negotiate with people, and it's a question of age, question of experience, it's a question of talent. People who are less talented than others, and you have to accept that. You cannot be a tennis champion. There's no recipe to become a tennis champion. That's it. It's unjust. But that's reality. So practice for me at the center of the reflection. Thank you.
Yeah, and definitely practice. I think, well, maybe I'll just before I turn it over to you, Rob, I would just say practice. I think in the field, definitely, but I would also say there's other ways of gaining practice that don't require actual field experience. Simulations, that kind of thing, can also be hugely useful in sort of honing some of those skills. Rob, and then Pega.
I wanted to both agree and slightly disagree with something that Pascal said, but also sort of generally build on what he said. I couldn't agree more about the experiential nature of learning to negotiate. Absolutely, that needs to be an aspect of one's process of building one's own capacity in negotiation. But what I was reflecting on is also the question about quantifying acceptance. For me, coming in as a researcher, if I were to try to apply some type of social scientific analysis to do a very rigorous analysis of what leads to acceptance and what leads to not acceptance, I would need to conceptualize acceptance as a researcher in some way if I wanted to look at it in comparative terms. So I absolutely agree in the context specific nature of it, and then you try to create a framework that applies to different contexts, you lose a lot of the nuance, but that as a researcher coming in, there can be value in that, in making thinking around what actually goes into acceptance and analyzing what works and doesn't work. In some way, conceptualizing and potentially in a quantifiable way could be useful toward that end. So I just wanted to flag that. But to me, it also sort of brings to mind sort of some greater challenges of integrating research more broadly and the field of humanitarianism, because this is the kind of research that I do. I try to do research that will inform practices and policies for humanitarians. But it can be tricky because of that very thing, because you're trying to draw generalizable conclusions by doing comparative analysis of different contexts that are themselves very, very different from one another. So I sort of just wanted to leave it with that sort of on the challenge of linking research with humanitarian practice, but also emphasizing the importance of it for both, negotiation scholarship and how we look at acceptance, but also more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Pega, any quick last word?
Sure, I'll be very, very quick. I just want to, adding on to the quantification of acceptance, I think having an acceptance-based approach to security risk management is very useful as it impacts our stakeholder mapping, the dialogue that we have, our operations. Quantifying it might not be as easy or necessarily useful, but what I think can be useful is having indicators that can show us when we have less acceptance. And that can, trigger a risk assessment and different things. And finally, just on diversity, I just want to drive the point home that we should see it really not as an inhibiting factor, but something that can really improve our activities and the quality of work that we do. And it shouldn't be seen as a top-down thing from headquarters or jumping on the diversity and inclusion bandwagon, but to really see the benefits of it. So yeah, thank you. I'll hand over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Pegah. Yeah, and I do see that there's a question around the digital domain, and for that, it came in late. I will just refer you to the digital risk article in the acceptance publication, which hopefully can give you some ideas there. Then just to thanks to our panelists and the authors of the publication, and also to GISF for providing this virtual forum, and also, of course, to Leah, who was unable to join us today. But with that, I think I will turn it over to Tara for the last word.
Thank you, Larissa, and all of the panel for joining us today. It's been really impactful, and I will just, in the essence of time, go ahead and launch the poll. We'd love to have your feedback and for you to continue to engage with us and let us know, further topics or conversations you'd like to see us have. And just wanted to again thank everyone, Larissa, Pascal, Aradia, Rob, and Pegah, for taking the time to be with us, and all of you who are joining from around the world as well. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a wonderful day wherever you might be.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The people doing the world's most important work are up against the biggest challenges. Since the 90s, security incidents involving NGOs have increased as their independence and impartiality no longer protect them. Humanitarians are actively targeted, as well as exposed to the risks of conflict and disaster, facing kidnapping, injury, and death in order to help those in need. And the threats to their safety means their ability to help diminishes too. NGOs began to create roles for dedicated security professionals, but they often lacked support and resources and worked in isolation. In 2006, a group of them from the UK and Ireland got together to develop coherent approaches to security risk management in the humanitarian space, eventually becoming an established network, the European Interagency Security Forum. With a strategic, inclusive, and collaborative focus, the forum has created a center of excellence, facilitates a peer-to-peer network, builds capacity for security risk management, and provides a voice for practitioners, reaching over 100 members. In response to growing demand, it has now gone global, bringing different perspectives, expertise, and resources to make core activities such as original research, trainings, workshops, and knowledge sharing more impactful than ever. As a result, organizations are able to build their security risk management on an even stronger foundation to keep more aid workers safe and enable sustainable access to communities in need. With a vision to see the work of the whole third sector done more effectively by supporting NGOs around the world, we are the Global Interagency Security Forum.